either projects that we could walk to from the office, and we're in the middle of Chinatown, so there's a lot in the area, but I was like, I'm lazy, I need to be able to walk there, or on an island, basically. I was like, if there's not a beach nearby, I don't want to do it. I was like, our success rate has been better than I would have thought, given that ambition. So I'm happy about that. That was where I was, what I mentioned before was like, every once in a while, you get reminded some perks about the job when you get to go to Barbados, for example. So that was nice.
Yeah, and what's interesting in that is like it's either Chinatown or it's either a tropical island. Maybe we could start with New York and actually, why is there a need to escape? What's that sense of intensity that the city gives to a practitioner that I guess in some way also demands an escape?
Yeah, I mean, I think New York. I think the same thing that makes New York really special is the same thing why you need to escape. Basically, I think it's a place where so many things come into New York. People come into New York from all over the world. Ideas are always coming into New York. And so when you're in New York, for better or worse, it's very easy to only look within New York, only kind of stay in your mentality of what's happening within New York, because the assumption is that what's happening in New York also has relevance everywhere else. That's a bit sometimes ambitious, that assumption, but I think there's enough connections to places outside of New York where that makes sense. But it's certainly it's a New York bubble, and there's so much stuff happening within this bubble that it keeps you quite occupied. And for me, especially, like Chinatown has become so important for me because it's a relatively small patch within Manhattan, but it's such an interesting neighborhood, such a fraught neighborhood. It's a super low income neighborhood. It's also, I'm Chinese American, so personally, there's a lot of like more and more kind of direct connection to it. But it's very like I'm looking inward and I'm looking tight and small and local. And then the opposite side, which is, I wouldn't say it's purely consigned to tropical, but the beach as an analogy is really useful to me because you're literally looking outwards. You're looking across this big horizon and out in the ocean. And oftentimes, especially in kind of island sites or smaller locations like that, the intent is actually to reach outward as opposed to dealing with just on what's on the island, if that makes sense. So the project in Barbados, for example, the client, the collaborator, the friend he's from there and he's really interested in basically celebrating what's already in Barbados, but in a way that's informed by all of his kind of international training and travels. So I think that kind of balance is really nice. I was realizing actually, as you were describing those two things as a kind of opposite, I feel like so I grew up in San Diego, and I grew up surfing. So I kind of feel like both the Chinatown side and the beach side have also very personal, like they're the two sides of me as like a person as well. So, but from an escaping New York point of view, that was always obviously like the appeal of going to work in an island and in a really tropical climate like that it's very different from New York.
I mean, there's a couple of layers here. One layer is you're growing up somewhere, but maybe we can talk about that. But maybe before we talk about that, I think we could talk about what this does to a practice. How does this inform what you do and how you do it? The geographical roots or the kind of spatial, the context that you choose.
I mean, from a very practical point of view, we have to operate pretty differently, as you can imagine, whether it's literally walking distance from the office or we're working internationally. But for example, like working from a practical point of view, working on an island, or I shouldn't say an island, I should just say somewhere that's out of the country, or let's say further than a 6-hour flight, is not hugely different than working in a neighboring state. One, just from a legal point of view, we can't practice. I'm licensed in New York, but I'm not licensed outside of New York City, or New York State, I should say. So you're always working with a local architect or representative, even more so when it's a foreign country. So I think that what we learned working, we did a bunch of projects in the Cayman Islands, so already starting in the Caribbean. And I think the adjustment we had to make was mostly in speed of the work, but also in the ability to actually, what's the way? Influence things as they were being built. So in New York, obviously everything's so tied in. Once it starts getting built, you're really just trying to keep it on track as much as possible. and so many things can derail it. Elsewhere, oftentimes like, oh, actually, we're deciding things as we go with the client, obviously, and we can actually make adjustments. And there's a looseness there, which is really nice. At the same time, there's moments where like, oh, this island, we're out of concrete for 3 months because everything's imported. So we have to wait on the timeline, and there's practicalities there. I think psychologically, originally it was really, I mean, the appeal was simply changing environments, like you had mentioned in the first question. But I'm realizing now also the really hyper local work that we're doing in Chinatown has also informed how we work in elsewhere. And I think a lot of it is actually just me being more comfortable, being very personal with the work, and saying, look, there's a very direct personal connection if I'm doing work in Chinatown based on my heritage and my family. But at the same time, I'm still very much learning about this neighborhood and the residents that live here and have lived here for generations. There's a lot of just like kind of observation and listening still. And at the same time, when we're working internationally, obviously you start off with just a lot of listening and observing and waiting and just kind of seeing how things are and listening to how other people are arranging. But you're also saying the project I'm doing here is also because of my experience as a person being from New York, being from California, being Chinese, even if we're working in the Caribbean. And so there's a really nice, like, I think learning how to operate in Chinatown is actually helping me feel more comfortable working in places that I really have very little geographic or personal connection to, except with the people that have brought us there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's weird. I think the environments are totally different, but the underlying sentiment oftentimes is quite similar, where there's an inherent culture in the place that we're working in, whether I'm part of that or not. And there's an interest in giving power to that culture in ways that maybe haven't been given before. And I think architecture is really interesting in that sense. You can kind of concretize things and design things for this culture that hasn't really been lifted quite yet, or lifted in different ways, I should say. So I think there's been a lot of interesting ties. It's still fairly new to me, it feels like, over the last 5 years. That we've been working more directly in Chinatown, but it's been applying really nicely to work further afield as well.
So was it a very conscious decision to be in Chinatown?
Yeah, at first, no. At first, it was rent is cheap.
Yeah.
And I just liked Chinatown, but there wasn't an intention of, oh, I think this is actually going to inform the practice. This is going to inform myself as a person, until we moved here. I was coming into Chinatown a lot because I lived really close by, but I would dip in to eat and I would dip in to kind of hang out. But once you start working here, and I'm here every day, and you start like working with all the local shops and understanding the people in your building. At that point, this was around 2018. Really feeling, oh, I actually feel like I can be an active member of this neighborhood, as opposed to someone that's frankly just kind of taking advantage of inexpensive rent and the food. I can actually now contribute to the neighborhood and want to take the time to listen and kind of be a part of this place. That only happened after I think I moved the office into Chinatown. It wasn't really an intentional thing when we first started. I'm really grateful for it. Like, I honestly think it saved my life in so many ways to have this neighborhood to be a part of. But it was a huge benefit, I think, that I didn't anticipate.
What I really enjoyed in how you talk about other sites, and it's almost like where you're now is a microcosm of a much kind of wider geographical kind of condition, international and so on, and global. I mean, there's something global. There's something about globalism or globality that I am getting a sense of from the way that you describe those connections. Do you ever think about that? Did you ever think about this kind of interconnected world? And
yeah, so I had just last week I had actually also a really nice interview with a good friend named Nafemi Marcus Bello, who's an industrial designer based in Lagos. And we were talking about this because I asked him how important it was for him, who now he's kind of everywhere. He's been traveling a ton, and how important it was for him to still be very much based in Lagos. And his work is very personal, informed, kind of, or he was calling them questions that he's had in his mind for over a decade, but all very geographically based around or nearby where he is. And I realized as we were talking, we connected over this, that we were both like, I mean, there's a little bit generalization, but we're like, we were both trained in a very kind of like international style modernism, him in design in general, me in architecture. And we're like, where everything was meant to be global, but clearly it was from a very singular perspective. And if anything, it felt like a bit of not only kind of imposing a very international style around the world, but by doing so also erasing a lot of really intricate, interesting local style that's coming up. And at the time when we were being trained, even the shift has been so dramatic where you can work much more internationally now than I think I could have even 10, 15 years ago. Like I can dip in and out physically, but also connect with so many people from around the world much more seamlessly. I mean, like we're doing right now. And we were like, I think the change, which is really exciting, is you can actually work even more and more locally, more and more kind of in the specifics of the geography that you're in, and see the resonance that that has in a much larger global context. Because you're able to kind of, it's easier for me to talk about NIF's work actually, weirdly, than mine. But I can see how NIF's work, which is so deeply personal, is suddenly having all this resonance when he's showing in Milan, or when he's like doing a project in London, or when he's like traveling through New York. And not because obviously everybody's from Lagos and Nigerian, but you can connect on the material level, you can connect on his narrative level, and it's just frankly more interesting than something that I think is intentionally trying to be international and kind of appealing to everybody. For me, that's the Chinatown side and the Asian American, Chinese American side. And I'm just starting to explore that again in the last few years. But I do think it's a way of working globally that is only possible because of social media, because of internet, because of the digital tools we have, because of the ability to connect like that. And I'm hoping it kind of produces much more interesting, much more unique design languages.
What's interesting is that yet on a political level, we seem to be going in reverse. So it's actually about kind of reversing globalization. The tariffs on films, on foreign films that were announced last week. I mean, that I was like, wow. So we're really speaking on every level here.
It's funny because I feel like there's a way to use localism, let's say, or tribalism, maybe localism as a way to silo yourself and like cut off and be like, I'm here to protect my own. I'm here to kick out immigrants, basically, and hold on to a very like singular vision of what I think the world or my world needs to be. And in a way, I feel like that's really born out of like an insecurity. It's born out of like a fear that my own little bubble is getting changed and getting transformed. More, hopefully, I think more optimistically is using that same kind of localism and local knowledge as a way to connect globally and across the borders that way, and really actually build kind of new cultures by bringing like multiple local knowledges together. I don't know, this is maybe getting a little bit too like high school political, but I do think there's something where like if you have an interest or like a deep appreciation of something that's very local or personal to you, then it's much easier to start sharing that out and much easier to be like, oh, I actually would love to kind of connect this custom or this material or this food or this design language with you from another place and actually also learn about yours. I think when you don't have that culture, I think it feels much more fragile, I guess. At least in the US, I feel like in the US, you're seeing that a lot with not only our administration right now, I think the rise in white supremacy, all these things that are about like locking down global connections or locking, like just kind of like making it very antagonistic to work with people outside of our little bubble. It feels like it's coming from a place of fear to me. The worry is it's getting more and more violent, and hopefully it's a kind of short-lived thing, but I don't know. It's a little freaky right now.
I mean, something interesting about Chinatown is that it's almost it's a kind of culture that is exported, replicated. You know, there's Chinatown in every city in the world, big city in the world. I mean, even in some really surprisingly small cities, in kind of small countries.
Yeah.
So, so do you? Is that an aspect that in some ways informs how you think about architecture, or are you learning from that, being in an environment that in some ways exists elsewhere?
Oh, that's really interesting. I don't think I've ever actually thought about the replicability of it in that way. Because you're absolutely right that there's this interesting importation, is that a word? Import of it. And, obviously they all have their slight differences depending where they are. But it's also, I think, the part of that I think I've really found most interesting is it's also kind of a weird invented culture. It's not Chinese from China. It's not classically American. The easiest analogy I can think of is it's like the orange chicken of like culture. So it's like Panda Express? I love Panda Express. So Panda Express is, I remember growing up and being like, and I can imagine a lot of like Asian American kids have this very similar sentiment. Growing up, I was kind of ashamed of Panda Express because you're like, that's not real Chinese food. But I also loved Panda Express. Like if I was in a mall and there was an option to go to Panda Express, I would like beeline it to that and you'd feel a little guilty. And I think what's been happening specifically in the food world over the last like 10 years or so is you're seeing a lot more pride and saying, look, this is not necessarily Asian cuisine. This is Asian American cuisine, or let's say this is a hybrid that's creating a third identity. And I think that's for me the most exciting thing about Chinatown or like Asian Americanness is it is this weird like hybrid third identity that does import really nicely because there is all this interest in all these other places around the world. I think I'm still learning a lot from Chinatown, and mostly for me, it's Manhattan Chinatown or New York Chinatowns. And a lot of that I think is about like, how do you navigate generational and historic references from places outside the US with very American requirements, both in terms of like survival and like economic prosperity. And how do you do this and create a unique identity from that? And Chinatown, I think, Chinatowns, I should say, generically have been able to do that, where, to your point, you can identify Chinatowns all around the world. And there is a version of a similarity there, aesthetically, materially, the food you can kind of expect. And that's actually really fascinating, that there is this connective tissue all around the world, which is really weird. I think it can inform. I'm trying to have it inform how we approach our design. Again, it's like, oh, actually, there's a lot of invention that can happen here to create like the new architectural language or a new kind of aesthetic, similar to what Chinatowns have been able to do, but also hopefully in our way.
I mean, this is so interesting to start to talk about kind of architectural practice, Dongping, because like there's an element of architectural practice that is kind of, this is not about you. And that's something that in a way we always have to teach our students, that yes, sure, there is kind of interest and self-referentiality, but there is also a point at which I think architecture stops being about the person, but it's about a wider conversation. So where does this come in? Where does this come in? This notion that this is not about you or us, or me, or anybody that is the creator of it. Is that something that kind of then starts to impact and influence how this manifests?
Yeah. So this is maybe a weird tangent, but I think about this a lot. But I had so my first studio at Columbia, where I went to grad school, was a studio that was kind of a throwback to like the 2000s era paperless studio, where Columbia was kind of like the lead in like computational design at that point. And I really wanted to take it because I was like, I need to understand where Columbia is coming from, and I want to do this first. And the studio was all about, it was kind of a version of coding, but the argument for the studio was very much like, look, we're going to input information and data, and then algorithmically, it's going to spit out a design. And it was meant to be very objective, right? Like, we're kind of removing authorship here. We're trying to trusting the data. And what I learned the most from the studio was, oh, that is bullshit in so many ways, right? Because at some point you're still tweaking. You're like, that's not quite the form I wanted. I'm going to twist the data a little bit. Oh, that's not quite the outcome I wanted. I'm going to like plug in a different set of data. And you're still manipulating it to get basically a version of what you wanted. And I feel like that I think we're trained very much as a service industry, and I think we are. But there's still so much authorship, even if you're trying to pretend like there isn't. And it took me forever to get to the point being comfortable that like whether I like it or not, I have a bias here that I'm bringing to this project. Hopefully at some point you're also hiring me or working with me because you also like my bias. But even if you're not, and I'm trying to really do this for you as the client or as the community that I'm working with, I'm still biased in some way. And so I think, and Chinatown was a big part of, I think, turning this corner a little bit to be like, all right, I'm just going to get comfortable being honest with me bringing a lot of personal opinion to this project. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it actually conflicts with what the other side of the table wants to do. And then that can result in, I think, hopefully really fruitful conversations. And but I've noticed it's been actually really helpful, both personally and professionally, to actually be much more upfront about where I'm coming from, being careful not to kind of impose that on the project we're working with without being informed, obviously, really deeply by who we're working with and the community we're in. But it's weirdly been much easier to say, like, look, I'm not pretending like I'm not who I am or that I don't have these kind of opinions or biases. And it actually makes it much easier to do the work in service of what it is that you're trying to achieve. I think a lot of that also comes with, maybe this is, I had this weird thought, or I've had this thought for a while, where in school, the hardest studio projects were always the ones, to me, that gave you a lot of freedom. That were like, oh, you can choose the site, or you can choose the program, or you can choose the agenda here. And as a student, it was like paralyzing. I was like, can you just tell me what I can't do? Because then I can actually figure out how to work within that. It's like the whole reason I got into architecture originally was I just really liked drawing, but I realized I couldn't be an artist because I needed someone to tell me what to do. And then I could respond to that or against that. And I kind of feel like I wish there was more practice in having an opinion. It sounds very weird. Of like, when you're in school, it's like, oh no, you should actually know what you want. It may not be what is right for the project. It may not be what the client wants, but at least have an opinion and a position that then you can adjust. And a lot of the work, even within the office since then, there's always this little bit of initiative side to the projects we do. We're like, no, it's really difficult, but I think it's important that we're saying this is what we want. And even if that balances out the kind of client work, I find it really important. I find it something that isn't often trained in school, even though it's there. It's a weird kind of like, I don't know how to put it. I guess a lot of it's like, okay, be honest with your bias, but also be comfortable with putting a position on the table, even if it's to start a conversation or start a design process, which can be really difficult sometimes.
I mean, I think learning a responsibility, learning that you also hold responsibility for defining constraints is actually really important. Because yes, I mean that's ultimately what we do. If we have too much freedom, then actually our job is to kind of define constraints within which we can actually then explore.
Yeah.
I mean that's the genius of the genre. I mean, I teach film, and the genius of genre in film is that the constraints are so clearly defined for the purpose of presenting that genre to the audience that wants to see that genre, that then within the genre, there is an immense exploration. So let's say with Western, we arrive to Robert Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is like a Western that's set, in the forest. I'm not sure which state, but it's not. It's kind of like it allows the form to then evolve and develop.
I'm curious with the film analogy. How am I going to ask this? Let's say if the director or whatever is the kind of analogy, or the kind of is the architect in this analogy. Is it more common, let's say, for a film studio or a producer to approach a director and say, like, I want to make a horror, you're the horror guy? Or I can imagine directors and actors too get kind of pigeonholed into genres, or is it common for a director to say, like, look, I think it's really important that I do, like, I'm thinking of Sinners, for example. My fiance and I just saw Sinners over the weekend. I'm going to do a film that is kind of a horror, kind of not, is based really specifically in a time period, is like crosses multiple genres, is a little bit hard to define, but also really crystal clear once you make it. Like the agency in this case that the director has to actually define, to your point, taking responsibility over the constraints is such a nice way to put it. That I think is something that I feel like architects so often are like, look, I wish I could do this, but the client doesn't want me to, or the site doesn't allow me to. And you kind of like push away responsibility. I think it's exactly that. I think it's exactly like, how do you feel comfortable taking on the responsibility of defining constraints? Sometimes it's legal, sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's genre-based. Yeah, I think how you put that is really, really beautiful. I think it's a really nice way to frame it.
Because I guess it's hard. Like, I guess when you're known for something, it's easy to just get a lot more work like that. But actually, you might want to be doing something else, or you might want to be exploring something else. I think that's probably, like, generally in creative production, that's the challenge. Like, a creative mind actually is expansive, whereas the commercial mind is actually quite the mind of the commerce, or the market is actually actually wants a product.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you ever have that kind of in your practice? Do you ever?
Oh, nonstop. That's I feel like generally that's always the friction of running a practice. And even deciding how to design something or what to design is like, because understandably, I can understand a client that's approaching you is oftentimes approaching because they've seen a project or seen your body of work, and they want what they've seen. At the same time, like, I think our office, my read anyway about our office is aesthetically, it's not really uniform. You can't say, like, you can't identify necessarily one of our projects, say like, oh, that's very much, well, maybe you can, but very much like a food or very much a Dongping Wong project. That's like exactly what they do all the time. So I think it makes it difficult for clients that don't know me well or don't know the office well to say, like, oh, that's exactly what I want, which of course then limits commercial opportunities. At the same time, it's like, well, that's not fun for me. And not kind of part of my personal project of like, well, this is the whole reason I got into this is not necessarily, originally wasn't to run a business. And the hope is that over time, you're building up a consistent like ideology or a consistent approach that then is the reason why people come to you. But that's a much harder thing to convey, much harder thing to sell. The one place where there's a kind of meeting of these two ways of running an architecture practice, I guess, is, for me anyway, in the Chinatown Asian American identity side, because I am actually very curious. I'm like, oh, what does Asian American architecture look like? And obviously there's a million versions of this, but what does Asian American architecture from me look like? And will there be a consistent aesthetic to it? And whether it's marketable or not is kind of a secondary question, but at least I think there's an interest in pursuing a consistency there, just as a challenge in a way. But because I think that that consistency has like again, a deeply personal interest for me. I don't picture that that's where the entirety of the body of work will go, but there is this kind of like band of study that I'm really interested in.
It's almost a curiosity. You're almost curious about what this could be. Yeah.
It also feels quite new, like nascent as a thing to explore. I mean, not only just in architecture, but sort of like aesthetically, culturally, and musically. But it also just kind of observing there's a lot more energy around it. A lot of people doing really interesting things in film and design in general. So yeah, it is a curiosity. It's also quite exciting. It feels like to be in the middle of it right now.
Mm-hmm. I think back to this earlier point about a kind of body of work. I guess as a profession, as an architect, you don't start your practice by designing your entire body of work. You don't start by knowing what your work will look like when one looks at it retrospectively and says, oh, this is this body of work. And then it perhaps in that body of work, the threads will be very clear, and there will be something that's clear that unifies the work. So you can't kind of design those threads. You still need some threads that will guide you. And you know, you say that you don't necessarily have a thread. There's this curiosity about Chinese American architecture. Are there any principles? That you kind of hold on to?
I need a better answer for this. I mean, what's interesting about the threads part is I actually think you can design a body of work from the beginning. I just don't think it's that interesting.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think it actually might be more successful from a business point of view, honestly, to do that. Like you're kind of branding what the next 15 years of work is going to look like, and it makes it much easier to make tangible and understand. But I don't think there's the exploration aspect there. And I think to do that, you're basically, you're relying on a thread that you already know exists that works. I had a lunch with a friend who also runs very similar size office, and we're very similar in our careers in New York the other day. And it was interesting that both of us were discussing how at some point when we first started our offices, the goal was to build the office. The goal was like, no, I want this type of office, right? I feel like every student, especially coming out of school or when they're ready to leave wherever they're working, is like, no, I want that kind of office. But lately, it's been different. Lately, it feels like instead, and I don't know if it's necessarily, I don't know if it's so much about not wanting to design the office anymore, but more like, I want to design project by project. Like that's the focus, back to the projects. And over time, you build up this body, this thread. And not really worry about the kind of overarching understanding of the practice as a whole yet, or as a commercial entity as a whole. I don't know if this relates. I feel like it kind of does, but often when I'm like at a review at a school or with the kind of younger designers in the office, I'm always like, oh, do you have a favorite architect? And almost universally, nobody has a favorite architect anymore. I'm actually very curious if your students do. But so, and I it was so weird to me because when I was training and going to school, I very much have favorite architects. It was like 3 that I was just like obsessed over, and we'll look over, and they're the same architects, and like it was like the same OMAs and like whatever that everybody else liked. And I think it was very much because like I grew up looking at books, and now that you're all the media is diffused through Instagram and through whatever that you're looking at images. And so everybody all the younger designers now have favorite projects, maybe even just favorite images, but not a favorite office. And I think there's a way to practice that's kind of similar to that, where it's not about a kind of larger entity. It's actually just about, maybe it's more like an artistic kind of pursuit, but it's like an individual's kind of series of projects. Except that, of course, architecture, you need a lot of people to do it together with, but that's the, or collectives kind of series of projects. I mean, with our work in terms of a thread, with my work in terms of a thread, I mean, again, I think that's why Chinatown has been so important, because there is threads there.
I guess, don't think there's also a name of the practice. You know, there's a, you know, OMA was Office of Metropolitan Architecture. It wasn't, you know, Koolhaas,
Yeah,
or Zengelis, you know. So there was, I think you're still set something with how you organize or how you name yourself, or like, I don't know. So is there anything in that? Is there anything in the
there is.
name that?
I think, and this is actually, I've been thinking about this part a lot too, is I think when I started the office, because it was food and previously it was called family, there was a real interest in kind of de-authoring the practice. It wasn't really about me. It wasn't really about the people that are in the office necessarily. And a lot of it was based off of the practices that I grew up adoring, like the OMAs. More recently, I think there has been, and I can maybe only speak personally, but there's been a really interest in like, okay, what is the authorship behind this? Because there's authorship whether you want it or not, even if you kind of pretend like there isn't, like we talked about before. Does it actually help? Does it actually help to put your name on the door in some ways? Not only from a business point of view, but from a kind of like there's a little bit of ability right now for me, for example, to hide behind the name of the office. And that can be really helpful in certain extents. That can also be a little bit detrimental, because I can kind of like, I can basically step away from some of the responsibility of the work and say, no, this is the office that I'm very much a part of, that I'm leading, but it's not me per se. I'm trying to be more and more comfortable. And I like the idea of like, no, just put your name on it, take that responsibility, take the authorship there, and make it personal. I'm curious if it's a similar. I remember the last thing I ever wanted to do was to have an office that was like Dongping Wong Architects when I started off. So I was like, this isn't about me. But lately it's been a little different. I'm like, oh, that scares me in a way that I think is actually kind of fascinating. Because I'm so used to the idea of an office being an entity that I'm within.
But you know, when I was with my students now in New York, we went and visited Stephen Hall's office, and then we also went and visited Di Lorenzo Fidio. What was interesting there is that actually the Stephen Hall's office, even though it's a big, I mean, it's not a massive office, it's like 20, 30 people, but I think then the nature of the work, the culture of production is quite thoughtful and tactile, let's say. And he was always an architect, right? I mean, he does his watercolors, but he was always an architect. Whereas Di Lorenzo Fidio, the guys that are actually known for art installations, are now a corporate establishment.
Yeah.
And it was quite interesting, where actually you see this, you see Stephen Hall practicing a lot more like an artist, and probably consistent and coherent in that mode of practice. And then you see the practice that, okay, I mean, it has the names of the founders, but it could have also been called something along the lines of OMA, because it would have still captured that kind of moment of it.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite interesting.
I was trying to think of, that's such an interesting, I've never thought of that framing. That's totally true. I mean, I'm trying to think of now, like looking at Hall's work and DSR's work. I mean, it's again, kind of cliche to say, I feel like I was much more influenced and impacted by early DSR work when they were an artist, a kind of pseudo artist group. And looking at Stephen Hall's work, I was like, oh, there's a clear, almost every project, there's a clear intent, or the interests are very similar through light and that kind of like color that bounces through and filtering of certain kind of effects that I don't see, I think, in the DSR work. Yeah, in a way I can imagine you're hiring DSR for the brand name and you're hiring Hall for what Stephen Hall himself brings to a project. I think are two very different things.
Hmm.
I did you read that article on Norman Foster in the New Yorker magazine?
Oh yeah, I've heard about it. I
It's
haven't
so
read it.
good. You should read it. It's so
Yeah,
fascinating.
of course I should.
It's
I mean,
very long.
I think I saw glimpses of it. I haven't read a full article.
It's super long,
Yeah.
but it's really fascinating. And Foster, I don't know where to place Norman, like Foster as I mean, as an office, it's corporate, but as a person, I can't figure out how to like place him because he's such a weird guy, but also so like, at least from what I can tell from reading and hearing stories about him, and such a particular person. And it sounds like one of the most interesting things I think in the article is it does feel like he fabricated a personality of being very wealthy in a way to appeal to very, very wealthy people. And it worked. It worked fabulously. um, like there was one anecdote where I think they were low on money as an office, like still doing fine, but like low on money. And he refused to give up his helicopter because, which was obviously not a necessary expense, but for him it was because it showed and it impressed his future clients and it showed what kind of like level of money that he operated at. That kind of like creating that persona that's kind of a fictional character that then becomes the real personification of the work in the office and the reason why people hire him. Weirdly, I kind of felt like Foster is still being hired a lot of times because of Norman himself and the aura that he's created around him in his office. And of course, there is the kind of like Foster and Partners brand and the kind of track record and the giantness of the office. But I think it was when in the article, they're talking about all these like billionaires on Park Avenue here that are all hiring them for their own towers. And they all feel like weird vanity projects just at these massive scales. And they're like, oh, you have a Foster project? I'm going to have a Foster project. I know Norman also, and that's going to be a bigger project than you have.
Bigger Norman.
It was bigger Norman. It was a weirdly like one-to-one direct, you know that guy, I know that guy too, kind of thing. And it was a very odd, surprising at that scale to still be kind of like so personal and kind of insecure like that.
And so don't think that the OMA you say you liked as a student. Do you think you liked the office as the idea of the office, or did you like the work? And do you like the
Both.
work now? And do you like
I don't like the work now as much, I should say. I don't want to be totally rude. I don't like the work as much now. I love the work and I love the office as a kind of ideal, at least how I understood it. I worked there for a little bit at the New York office. And in my mind, it was very much like an unauthored kind of body, a collective that everybody bought into. It's interesting now to still see. Well, I guess there's two things that are interesting with the OMA stuff. It's interesting to see how insistent people are to still credit REM for a lot of stuff. And I understand that. And also to see other partners getting credit without REM's name attached. Which I can imagine is both intentional from within the office and from these partners within the office to finally claim their own name away from REM. But even that kind of idealism of that larger collective, I think it was inescapable. The kind of singular author thing was a little bit inescapable. I don't know how true that was from an operational point of view, but growing up, I was like, oh no, it feels like this really relatively democratic office. Working there was a little different, but as an ideal, that was kind of what you wanted, or what I wanted, I should say. And it also felt like my read, maybe again being very biased on it, was a transit into the work that was meant to be a little bit more objective how they approach things, very program driven, obviously, less artistic, I would say, at least how it was presented. For example, like material was never hugely considered at the beginning of an OMA project. It was kind of like applied to foam blocks, basically. I wouldn't really call OMA like an artistic pursuit, an artistic studio in the way that like maybe a hall is or other offices are. And at the time that I really liked it, I wouldn't necessarily call it a corporate entity either. Maybe now it much more is, but that was the ideal. I don't think that version of an office feels a little less relevant now somehow.
Yeah, I've been thinking that a lot recently, and it's really nice to test it because, and I wonder what is it that renders it irrelevant, or what is it that renders it less relevant? Because technically, they are kind of spearheading discursivity as a kind of form of practice. Yet somehow that's starting to feel slightly, I don't know, I maybe wouldn't even use the word irrelevant, but slightly unuseful, or slightly not useful, or non-useful, or
that somehow felt like it's like the worst thing to call OMA not useful. And when I'm trying to think of like this is gonna get me in trouble with like OMA friends, but I'm kind of, when I picture OMA like physically, in my mind I picture like a big warehouse that has all this crazy stuff. I mean, in an ideal sense, this big warehouse that all this like crazy ideas going on, people from all over the world really mixing up ideas. But it still has this kind of like big umbrella, big warehouse feel that I feel like doesn't, how do I say it? I think it relates to the question earlier about like the kind of global approach. It still feels like it's taking this kind of big-handed, big box approach to like how to work internationally. It doesn't feel like there's the kind of like precision or specificity that you see from more personal offices. Like, for example, I think when you hire a corporate office, like a very clear corporate office, I don't think you're hiring them for local specificity. You're hiring them for experience, for scale, for a kind of global reach. My assumption is you're probably still when you're hiring OMA, that's what you're hiring them for, with the design chops that the history of OMA still brings with it, and the intelligence there. But it kind of feels almost how it operates, maybe too big and blocky. It doesn't feel nimble in the way that I think so much interesting stuff is happening is very like fluid. I'm trying to like put words to it and trying to think of like, is that true? Or is that just like a perceptive thing at the moment?
Yeah, is it an impression? Absolutely. Yeah.
But is that how you're feeling about it?
Well, again, I don't know whether it's because we've all become so image driven, but like when I go somewhere, it's not like, oh, I need to go and see an OMA building. I feel like, oh, I need to go and see a Louis Kahn building, or I need to go and see, actually, I'd like to go and see a Rogers building because I will appreciate the detail, or I will read it. I will spend some time reading the building. There's something to read here. Whereas the OMA, I guess maybe there is less of that urge, or there is less of that need to read, because maybe there is like an image comes in as a mediator. So I don't know. Maybe that's what it is.
When you say read, are you talking about looking at the tangible architecture in front of you?
Yeah, looking at the architecture in front of me and kind of understanding the kind of the logic, the intelligence of the building.
OMA projects, even my favorite OMA projects, were never experiential. They were never about like how it felt to be in the project. One, because I think materiality was not central to the original to kind of process of it. But even spatially, like the interest in OMA projects, I feel like was just kind of like really interesting programmatic relationships, maybe some interesting form.
Or some bold moves, like a really thick door, or like a really
Yeah.
window, like a really massive curtain or
Yeah,
something.
interesting proportions sometimes. But like I was thinking about this because when you brought up Louis Kahn, for example, my very first kind of like grade A architecture thing that I ever saw was the Salk Institute in San Diego. And the Salk Institute was like, there was so much intelligence behind it that I learned about later, but really it was just about that one view. It was like that one singular moment with like the ocean and the horizon in the back. And you don't really get that kind of like visceral, oh shit, like moments with OMA projects, I don't think, that I can think of. And I think I feel like some of it, weirdly, I kind of feel like OMA is like architecture for architects. Like there's almost like too much intelligence like built into it. You have to really understand what it's about to really appreciate it. Whereas I think maybe the further I get in the profession, I'm like, no, I just appreciate when a building's really beautiful.
Mhm.
Scales are stunning, and the structure is really interesting, and like the tectonics are really interesting, and it's a much more kind of like simple, yeah, like visceral feeling.
So does this evolution of thought maybe coincide with you practicing more?
Yeah, it does. I think it has a lot to do with the more I practice. It has a lot to do with the further I am away from school, to be honest.
Mhm.
Um, and the further, the more and more I kind of, well, there was a period probably within the like when I first started the practice until like 5, 10 years, because I've worked by myself or had this own practice, I should say, for 15 years now. So for a while, it was like a really deliberate move to not be within the architectural uh, sphere of New York. Like I had architecture friends, of course, but I was like, I just need to get out of the architecture bubble. And luckily, a lot of the client work was like in the fashion world or like very kind of like nearby fields, but it was like fashion, art, food, all these things. And I feel like the further and further I got from the architecture discipline culturally, the less appreciation I had for all of the kind of very architect for architect
Mhm.
things he cared about coming through school. And the more I was like, and especially when you start, I think as you work with clients, oftentimes like clients don't give a shit about kind of deep academic concepts as much as I may love doing those. They just, they want to know how it feels. They want to know how it looks. They want to understand the material samples you're bringing in and how it's going to like affect what it's going to look like in the neighborhood, how it's going to be perceived by people who are walking down the street, how it's going to photograph. All these things that I think have really important like cultural effects, but are not necessarily overtly academic.
Mhm.
And that was a harsh lesson, I think, that I was like, oh, even now thinking back to like my grad school experience, I'm like, what did I learn that's applicable directly at grad school? It's easier to talk about even things that I learned that I didn't want to do. Like one of my favorite professors at grad school, almost the only thing he ever asked whenever we present work to him was, yeah, but what's the point? And it was a very hard thing to answer directly and clearly. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I do think the longer I practice, certainly, and the more I'm working with people that are not trained architects, the more the kind of like experiential side of things becomes important.
The two words that I've written here in my notes are community, which I think in some ways a word that describes maybe some form in which you practice, in the way in which maybe you perceive practice. And then the word culture, which, you know, I've been repeating this in the recent conversations that I've had, that I was in the last 12 months exploring Irish architectural culture, which I think really could be described as a culture because there are a series of references that are deeply rooted in how culture more broadly operates, and actually probably links to Kahn and Venturi and Denise Brown and probably Mies as key references. And so I guess culture is something, culture of the profession is something that is about those inner professional conversations. And then we have community, which is something that maybe is slightly more external oriented, or it's something that is more, maybe not even external, but it's about fashion and art. And it's more about a kind of group, regardless of the medium that we are practicing. And I guess what we've done now, we've talked about architectural culture in many ways, because we've spoken about your kind of initial interest and admiration for OMA. And then you've just mentioned now the connections to the world of fashion or the world of publishing, perhaps, or like other worlds.
I will say every time I use the word community or even culture, I kind of flinch a little bit because they do kind of feel like stand-ins for things that are a little bit amorphous. And there's something where like everybody kind of understands what you're talking about. They sound good as a buzzword. But when you drill into what you actually are meaning very specifically, it's hard to define. And I've been trying to figure out how to either use those words more specifically or understand why those words have stuck around for me so much. And I'm gonna try to solve this live while we're talking, but just very hard. Yes, please, please.
Maybe I can ask another question. And I guess maybe one thing that could connect, let's say, culture and communities, let's say your association to Virgil Abloh and the work you've done with him, and in some way, the work that's emerged from, I think Virgil was such a big character that in some way he didn't just generate a community, but he also generated a culture, which is kind of a way of thinking. And I just wonder whether maybe that's an example of something, some place where maybe these two things meet, or do you feel connected to that as culture or as community?
I think they absolutely relate to one another. I think, so lately, one thing that as a word anyway, that's been really fascinating me is power. And not only because you see how it's abused recently in this country, but even when we're talking about like culture or community, I think what's really interesting, I think Virgil's a great example here where in my mind, one of the greatest effects that Virgil had was shifting a kind of power a little bit. So shifting from, so even when, I remember at some point, I think it was relatively recently after you got appointed the director at Louis Vuitton. And I don't remember exactly how we got in this conversation, but he was very aware of his position there. He was very aware, basically he was like, I know I'm a halo for them. And it was a really interesting clarity that he's like, I know exactly why they've hired me. I know exactly what I can bring to them. I know I'm going to help them sell stuff. I know that they want to tap into a Black culture that I represent. I also know that there is a huge opportunity here for me to like push and uplift and bring a community along with me. And it was like that kind of like, oh, okay, yes, I'm servicing a level of power here. that's taking advantage of who I am. But also I can actually create new power for people that didn't have it before. And suddenly, like now, even years later after he passed, it's like, oh, there's actually cultural power within uh Black designers, architects in a certain in all these like cultures that didn't exist or weren't nearly as visible pre-Virgil. And I think if there is a thread to a lot of my work, I think this is out of personal interest. It's like, oh, the projects that I think I'm most interested in are the ones where we can use architecture to contribute to kind of a new power, basically. Um, and it's whether it's cultural relevance, whether it's a place for a community that may already exist to suddenly have visibility, or what Virgil did, I think, was like actually create whole new communities based on like a new type of, even if it was around sneakers, for example, like suddenly you had all this like community power, but also financial power and like economic power and like power within fashion and design. And I think culture is such a hard thing to define, like what is a cultural production or not. But I think you come together, a community, you're kind of like coming together because there's a sense that you can get more done when you have more people around. And you have a kind of power to kind of make influence and feel like you belong somewhere and feel a little safe. Culture as a power, I think, is like when, this is again a little bit tangential, but I also think about this a lot. Like in the US, to me, like American culture is Black culture, or Black culture is such a huge part of American culture. And in a way that I think is very threatening to a lot of people. I think why you see so much backlash. And ultimately, I'm like, oh, it's not only is there economics behind this and finances behind this, but it's ultimately the identity of an entire country is potentially shifting and transforming and threatened depending on which side of that coin you're on. And even more than money, more than a position, it's like, I think that power is I get to define what being American means in the context of this country, or what it means to be, how to create American culture is kind of a wild thing to fight about. I mean, not a wild thing. It's very obvious why you're fighting about it. I think that's where the architecture becomes really interesting, because I think so many, and myself included, look to architecture as these like markers of like cultural milestones, not only because they oftentimes will last for a long time, but they end up establishing, oh, this as a physical institute and a physical place is a really important thing. It's materially very hard and concrete and permanent, but also establishes certain values that are perceived as really important. Whether it's a museum or a research lab like Salk. And I don't think I ever quite understood architecture like that until the last 5 years, that I understood it through Chinatown, through personal, through working with people like Virgil, where you're like, oh, that's actually that's kind of a role that architecture can play, or it does play. And so even working on a project like Barbados, it's like, oh, there's a really amazing culture here already. And there's a way to put a stake in the ground of making it even more powerful through architectural interventions or through projects here. I don't know if I don't remember exactly what the question was, but I don't know. I'm trying to formulate this as I kind of spit it out. Like I don't know if it's weird to say that, let's say culture and community are in the service of power. I think that's probably a little bit reductive. I don't know if one comes before another. I kind of have a feeling that like real cultural transformations or cultural production is born out of a community that creates a kind of momentum and creates a kind of enough pride to create something that represents a cultural production, whether it's like an object or an architecture or.
Yeah, I guess what's interesting is like, again, let's call it communities, the place where different, let's say, forms of practice meet. So an architect meets a fashion designer, an artist, a musician. I think what's interesting in those environments is that we actually learn from others, or we see different speeds at which, I mean, this was my discovery when I first encountered the fashion world, with the speed. And with the speed in which ideas get produced into a product, which in architecture takes so long. And, then obviously artists are just kind of committed to their work. It's like kind of this ongoing process. There's no beginning and an end. You see musicians that also operate in a completely different way, like the infrastructure that supports music is a completely different infrastructure to the one that supports artists, and so on and so on. So I guess when you find yourself in this network, you're also able to, I guess, learn. You're able to learn from other fields and the way they operate. And I wonder whether in that learning, you're then able to, well, I guess whether then you're able to apply some of that knowledge to the way that you work within your domain, which is
actually, in some ways very directly. So when the office was first working with Virgil, and to an extent very much so with Kanye back in the day, because they were also both so central in fashion, like really pushing fashion was their main pursuit, that speed was huge. And so fast forward, it became really important in my office to basically put designs on the table right away. So for example, in the office, I always say, like, you have to get through a lot of ugly ideas first to get to like a really beautiful idea. Sometimes you land a beautiful idea from day one, but it's rare. But to do that, you have to put like something on the table that is maybe not really very fleshed out yet. It's kind of intuitive. It's your first reaction to something. Get that out of your head, make a model of it, make a drawing of it, make it tangible and physical. We can look at it, and then we keep moving. Basically, we have to work. It was really nice to see how fast fashion moved. Fashion is like, you're moving really fast and you're producing a finished garment really quickly. Architecture, even if we're working that fast, it's still in the service of a building that won't happen 2, 3, 4, or 5 years later. But it was really helpful to learn how to move quickly from a design process point of view, as opposed to thinking really linearly from big idea to small and then producing a kind of final product months later. It was like, no, I want to see designs on day one. And then we back up.
So was this an expectation from the client, i.e. from Virgil and Kanye? It was like, I want to design now.
Yeah. Very much. It was like, great, I have an idea. What does that look like today? What does that look like in an hour? And it's also where, from a practical point of view, I started using hand sketches way more in that period, because they're obviously very fast, and you can convey and capture an essence of an idea, because I think there's like, the tool is much more directly linked to you as opposed to filtered through a software. Your tool is your pen versus like being the constraints of whatever software you're using. And so I could actually get onto a piece of paper a design, but also I think a kind of soul behind the design much quicker than I could making a rendering or a model. And so within 5 minutes, you could respond to something that a collaborator was saying, put that in front of the table, like, yes, okay, we now have something physical that we both agree on. Now let's move from there.
But does this cause an issue down the line? Because maybe later on they won't realize that actually there's a point at which you can't change things. And
sometimes. So the funniest thing on the Kanye side was that you show him a sketch That's it. That's the one. We're going to do that. And then sometimes you really can actually do it. And you're like, oh shit, whatever resources we had to like pull from thin air to make that sketch happen, we made. Other times, okay, that sketch idea is much more ambitious or unrealistic than what the scope of the project really is. The Kanye answer was, all right, we'll just change the scope of the project. Our project is now 10 times bigger and 10 times bigger again in order to match the initial vision, right? That's really interesting, but it also meant very little things actually physically ever got done, like architecturally. The Virgil approach was sketch, that's the one, let's pursue that. 2 weeks later, another sketch, that's the one, let's go with that. It shifts, it's much more like nimble. And a lot of that was responding to very realistic constraints. A lot of that was responding to, we have like schedule we're trying to keep. But the Virgil approach was also I feel like his entire body of work was one study model after another, just made real, made into production, sellable. But it was a constant stream of like, I have an idea, I'm going to make it real. I'm going to make it real. And they're all imperfect. They're just kind of like steps through creating this larger body of work. Kanye's approach is like, it has to be perfect. It has to be the greatest thing ever. And so we're going to spend years perfecting it before I release it out into the world. I think the Virgil approach was much more, in my mind, aligned with a lot of the fashion world that I see, because you're like, we don't have time to perfect this. We have a fashion show. We just did a fashion show. We have another one in 3 months. We have to move really quickly. And over time, you'll see the larger ideas that we have, but we have to move quickly. We have to move into production quickly. We have to move into detailing and technical qualities really quickly. And there's something really nice about that, applying to that a really slow profession like architecture. Not necessarily making buildings quicker, but generating ideas and moving through ideas much quicker. It was also the other side that I learned a lot from it was even now seeing a lot of friends within fashion that are doing collections that are very much, again, very personal and very much based on identity, very much based on a very specific culture that they're representing. Seeing the effect that has once they release a collection on the culture that they're representing and on people that are not necessarily from that culture resonating with that. Mm-hmm. And you're like, oh, that feedback loop in fashion is so much faster. And so it's really kind of like validating. You're like, okay, if you actually work in that way and have that authorship there, that resonance will be there. With architecture, you have to have a lot more faith because you're like, okay, this won't hit the world for another 2 or 3 years. So that was really nice to see, I think, for industries that move a lot faster than architecture, that it was worthwhile, basically, to kind of pursue that way. Similar with my friend earlier that I mentioned, Nif, on the industrial design and furniture side. Again, it's quicker than the architectural side. In the office, I think to balance the slowness of architecture, we started doing things like Mahjong Club and Food Radio that we could have an immediate feedback on basically the product or an event that we were doing. You know, that whole cycle was like 2 weeks, and you'd see the final product, you'd see the community aspect, you'd see the event aspect, and you'd see how much interest it generated into the next one, but very purposely like quick.
I guess you also, as a person, you need that. Once you've experienced the speed of how quickly ideas can move, I guess you cultivated this urge to also sometimes be able to just do something quickly.
Well, I mean, I'm sure you're very familiar. I feel like when you're given a lot of time, I just went through this. I was working on this kind of personal project, and because it was personal, I didn't really have a deadline, which is always a problem. And I ended up like, I had an intuitive initial idea that I really liked. And then because I had time, I kept redesigning it and redesigning it and redesigning it and redesigning it. And only yesterday I was like, oh, I actually just ended up back where I was 2 weeks. You just overthink it a lot. And because with a thing like that, there's never like, right, obviously there's never like the right answer that like clearly stops what you're doing. So I think that way of working really quickly is to both trust your instinct when you put something on the table and there's something that resonates within that design. And in a way, it's like not being overly precious. You're never going to hit that kind of perfectionist mentality doesn't really help. And also lets you keep exploring. You're like, look, this is one part of a large exploration that I'm doing.
Well, it's also testing. I guess what you've done in that circle is that you've actually tested that original idea. And
Yes.
then
With the OMA reference point, there's the classic OMA model of working, which I'm curious if it's still the day where you're like, we're going to do 100 foam models or study models. And the buy-in is that you're going to reveal the best design from this kind of like overproduction of ideas. And it was rarely ever the case.
yeah.
It is a version of testing, but it also felt like you're doing this just to confirm your initial bias, your intuition, and then also to try to like prove to the client that you did a lot of work. But I think you also, like, as you practice more, as I practiced more, and as I got more comfortable with my own beliefs, I was like, oh, that's also kind of like you're sort of shirking responsibility when you can be like, no, I actually, honestly, I think this is the best thing to do right now, and let's just do it.